Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Wilbert Mukori. I have said numerous occasions that Zimbabwe is a failed state. I don't think many Zimbabweans could honestly deny that. In 1980, soon after independence, a Japanese intellectual visited the country, Ken Yamamoto, and in one of his articles, he said Zimbabwe had the potential of becoming the South Korea or the Singapore of Africa. 43 years later, we are anything but a successful country. Up to 49% of our people are now living in abject poverty. And the future looks grim. It's a nightmare. You think by now we'll have an inkling at least of what has gone wrong. After all, Zimbabwe, we used to pride ourselves for at least the first 10, 15 years after independence as being one of the most literate countries in Africa. And yet, when we are up to our eyeballs in this hell on earth that we have created for ourselves, we still have no clue what is the problem. Let's listen to this. She is supposed to be one of Zimbabwe's intellectuals, I suppose, socialites, making a contribution on that very question, why is Zimbabwe?
utaure zvaunofunga mucomment section nekulike
kana zvinhu zvaramba kufamba munoblema asiri kutonga. Kotoita vanhu vakaenda kuchikoro vanozvibvuma kuti asiri kutonga ndiye auraya nyika, vari kutonga havana chavatadzi. Saka kutonga kudii? Saka ari kutonga ndiani? Kana asiri kutonga ari kuondonga zvinhu, vari kutonga vasingagona kuzvikorekta vakatarisa. Saka ari kutonga ndiani? Bvunza ari pasaidi pako, ari kutonga ndiani?
So this is Apostle Chiwenga accepting that the country is a failed state. And according to him, the question we should be asking ourselves is, who is responsible for the mess? I think for many people who have followed the Zimbabwe politics would not fail to realize where the question is leading. He is one of those clearly who believe that the opposition should not be blamed for the country's economic mess. We should blame those who are in power, i.e. Zanu PF. I think that is the wrong question. And to keep on asking the wrong question is unbelievable. Why do I say it's the wrong question? Well, we asked that question in the late 1990s. And people came to the conclusion that yes, Zanu PF was corrupt and incompetent and tyrannical. It took 20 years for people to come to that conclusion. But put that one aside. We came to that conclusion. What was the solution? The answer was simple. as long as Zanu PF is able to rig the elections, the country was going nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. Zanu PF will remain in power as long as the party is able to rig the elections. And so the conclusion was we need democratic changes so that we can stop Zanu PF rigging the elections and restore the freedoms and rights of the citizens, including the right to have a meaningful say in the governance of the country. That was at the heart of the argument. The MDC was launched in 1999 on the wave of that fundamental national sentiment that we need democratic change. The question now is, therefore, why is it that 23 years since the nation came to that conclusion, why is Zanu PF still rigging the elections? Zanu PF has just rigged the elections in August this year. And there can be no doubt that Zanu PF rigged the elections. The AU, the continental body, SADC, the regional body, and our own Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, the body appointed, one of the commissioners appointed to observe the elections and report on it. They all agreed that the August 23 elections were flawed and illegal. So Zanu PF was able to rig the elections. The question then is, after 23 years, why is Zanu PF still able to rig the elections? Ask the right question and you get the right answer. Ask the wrong question and you'll be going round and round and round in circles. We know it is Zanu PF that is in power, that has destroyed the country's economy. We have known that all along. Since the late 1990s, we realized that Zanu PF was the problem. Hence the need for democratic changes. The question then is, why is it that 23 years later, and 5 of those years were absolutely important. Those were the GNU years. MDC had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms which would have stopped Zanu PF rigging the elections there and then. So the 2013 elections should have been free, fair, and credible. Why were they not? Easy. MDC had failed to implement even one token reform. SADC, who had been instrumental in forcing Zanu PF to sign the Global Political Agreement 2008, which led to the formation of the GNU, told Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends, you cannot go into these elections without meaningful reforms. They wanted the 2013 elections postponed for that exact purpose. But the advice fell on deaf ears. Morgan Tsvangirai and company decided they were going to go into those elections. And of course, Zanu PF rigged the elections, as SADC had predicted. And Zanu PF has been rigging elections ever since. For somebody, for any Zimbabwean who has been following the politics of the country, to fail to realize that the primary purpose of the 2008 to 2013 GNU was to implement the democratic reforms, beggars belief. And for that same individual to fail to see it, even now, with the benefit of hindsight, you honestly despair. Is this really the nation that prided itself in being one of the most literate countries in Africa? The answer is yes. And the only conclusion one can make is, with all that literacy, we can't even figure out what is gone wrong. Even now, with the benefit of our hindsight, we despair. Absolutely despair. This argument has been made so many times, and yet somebody still continues wittering, asking the wrong question. Oh, we can't blame those who are in opposition, we should blame those in government. People have said here and on other platforms that Zanu PF would lose the elections to a troop of monkeys if the monkeys were the only other alternative on the ballot paper. If, that's the important if the elections were free, fair, and credible. Since the late 1990s, when people made that decision that we need democratic change, people had already made up their mind. They'd realized that Zanu PF was getting them nowhere. If they're going to end the Zanu PF dictatorship, they needed to reform, to carry out the reforms so that elections are free, fair, and credible. And given the opportunity to remove Zanu PF, yes, they would vote for a troop of monkeys. So the most important question then is, why is it that we have failed to implement the reforms so that we've got free, fair, and credible elections? Triple C should not have lost these elections if the elections were free, fair, and credible. They should have lost the 2018 elections if the elections were free, fair, and credible. They should have lost the 2013 elections if the elections were free, fair, and credible. So the relevant question is, why is MDC, Triple C keeping on participating in elections that are flawed? That is the right question you should be asking. To keep on wittering and asking the wrong question, why is Zanu PF destroying the country? Because Zanu PF is able to rig the elections and stay in power. Stop Zanu PF rigging the elections, and you will have a competent government which will be accountable to the people. If those who are, you've risked life and limb to get into power, have failed to implement even one meaningful democratic reform in 23 years, 5 of which in the GNU. The problem is with the opposition then. The opposition are helping to keep Zanu PF in power. That is the truth. Zanu PF has not managed to stay in power all these years these last 23 years because it is powerful. No. It has managed to stay in power because the opposition has sold out. The opposition had the opportunity to implement the reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. They failed to implement even one reform. And not only that, they've been participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy. What I find shocking here is that the opposition themselves have admitted all these things. And yet you still have some individuals out there who still refuse to accept that admission. I've often quoted this. This is Tendai Biti admitting in 2015, soon after the 2013 elections. Look, we can't keep on participating in flawed electoral processes that serve to give big benefits to the dictators, such as Robert Mugabe. Mugabe has perfected the art of winning elections, rigging, we should have said that, and winning the elections. Here was an opposition leader acknowledging the sheer futility of keeping on participating in a flawed process. David Coulthard, another opposition leader, went even one step further and identified why the opposition are keeping on participating in these flawed elections. And this is what he said in his book. The 2013 electoral process was so flawed, so illegal, that the only logical step was to withdraw, which would have compelled SADC to hold Zanu PF to account. But such was the distrust between the MDCT, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, and the MDCN, led by Professor Welshman Ncube, that neither could withdraw for fear that the other would remain in the election, win seats, and give the process credibility. In other words, they all remained in for the sake of trying to win those few seats they knew Zanu PF would be giving away to entice the opposition to participate. Zanu PF needed the opposition to participate just as much as Zanu PF had accommodated these opposition guys during the GNU. Mugabe bribed them with the trappings of power. During the GNU, he learned that as long as you give the opposition a share of the spoils of power, they'll do what you like. And this is exactly what both Tendai Biti and David Coulthard are admitting here. Even if we accept that some people failed to comprehend what was going on during the GNU, now, a decade since the end of the GNU, with the benefit of hindsight, one would have thought that some of these individuals, the penny has finally dropped. And yet here we are. What this Pastor Chiwenga was talking about there is his views, but we know that there are hundreds of Zimbabweans out there who share the same view. the country's economic meltdown is not caused by the opposition, it's caused by the ruling party. That is a very simplistic, naive, if I may say so, analysis of the problem. Yes, Zanu PF is corrupt and incompetent and are responsible for dragging the country into this mess. The real big question is, why are they still in power? When 23 years ago, the nation came up to the right decision and said, we have got to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections and extending their rule. And the reason for it is the people we entrusted that task to implement the democratic reform sold out. Mugabe bribed them. And they kicked reforms out of the window. And to keep on going, say, oh, let's get, why is Zanu PF destroying the country? What you've got to look at is, why have we failed to stop Zanu PF rigging elections and staying in power? That is the crust. That is the gist. That is the heart of the problem. It is disappointing. Of course, it is disappointing to find ourselves in a situation where 43 years later, and come 2028, it will be 48 years after independence, and we still can't hold free, fair, and credible elections. That is at the heart of our problem. And to be quite honest, I think it is no exaggeration to say there are a significant number of Zimbabweans out there who don't even know what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. And you'll be surprised to know that some of those people are intellectuals, professionals in their own right. Some of them even hold university degrees, and from reputable universities, some of them. So there is some truth that we are, yes, Zimbabweans, at least until 20 years ago, were definitely some of the most literate people in Africa. But I've come to the conclusion that I think the criteria of literacy should be reviewed, particularly in our case. It is not just enough to be able to read and write. Do we really understand what we have read? That should be the question. I'd like to share with you something that an English poet, Alexander Pope, said. I think it is very relevant in our situation. This is Alexander Pope. And what he said was something that maybe Zimbabweans should seriously look into now. And that is that we have read, and we can read and we can write, but sometimes it is important to be able to read and understand, to write and understand. In one of his poems, A Little Learning by Alexander Pope, he said, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Parian spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. I'll just stop at that last stanza. I think if you are listening, you can search for yourself the poem and read the full length of it. But I think that is one of our biggest problems in Zimbabwe. We think we are very learned people, but in reality we are not. And one of the problems of thinking that you know when you don't is that you're not receptive to arguments, to reason, because you think you know. Many people there think they are wiser than King Solomon himself, and therefore then have not been receptive to even the arguments that were put by others. Zimbabweans have been told on countless occasions, let's be honest, countless occasions, to implement the democratic reforms, ensure free, fair, and credible elections. And yet, the opposition has dragged the nation into one election after another with no reforms implemented. None. And we're still, the people themselves believed it. In these last elections, 2023, Chamisa was boasting that he had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. So Zanu PF will not be able to rig the elections. And it is shocking that even the intellectuals out there never challenged him. Even when they knew that that was nonsense. One of the organizations in Zimbabwe, Team Pachelu, had done a wonderful job on the voters' roll, discovering that there were so many flaws in it. The voters' roll was in shambles. And to go into an election with a voters' roll that was in shambles just didn't make any sense at all. And yet here we are. The leader of the opposition claiming that he had plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. How many people out there put the question to Chamisa and say, how can you say that when the voters' roll is in such a mess? They accepted it. Some of them even boasted of, we are helping, we are with donations and so forth. They believed him. And when he said God is in it, that was enough. They definitely believed him. How naive can you be? How can you be one of the literate people on the continent of Africa and you believe something as idiotic as that? It turned out that Triple C even failed to deploy election agencies at the polling stations. Something as basic as that. And yet he is somebody who claims he has plugged all the vote rigging loopholes, and yet cannot even deploy election agents. And what is more, he had been given the money to deploy these election agencies. Triple C, Chamisa and this Triple C were hell bent on participating in these elections, knowing fully well that the process is flawed. Zanu PF will rig them, and that by participating, they will only give SADC the excuse to give Zanu PF legitimacy. And at the end of the day, Zanu PF is in power. And then somebody has got the audacity to ask, how can we blame the opposition when when they are not the ones in government? Well, they are not the ones in government. We blame those who have allowed Zanu PF to stay in government. That's the ones we should blame. Zanu PF should not be in government if the elections were free, fair, and credible. As I said, Zanu PF will lose to a troop of monkeys. So we should blame, why are you participating in these flawed elections to give Zanu PF legitimacy? Ask the right question and you'll get the right answer. Before I close, I'll just read one question there from Kampala. It says, some of our young YouTubers in Zimbabwe can't even read English in their own language properly. One was even struggling to read the word implement. Well, I have to say, the standard of education in the last 20 years, particularly, they've gone down, particularly in the rural schools. Unfortunately, Mugabe was more interested in quantity than quality. And education has been one of those victims. And the country has got the habit of churning out all these graduates, even from some of our institutions like UZ and so forth. But I believe the quality of education that they are delivering there has gone down significantly. Simply because we've lost so many teachers. The schools and universities are so poorly funded. The quality of education has gone down. But to go back, wind back to 1980, I think the quality of the education was good. And I think we had a lot of Zimbabweans who could read the word implement. But now, even those who were educated at those times, I honestly doubt whether some of them even today understand what it means. Even now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can't believe the number of Zimbabweans who honestly do not know that MDC guys sold out and failed to implement even one token reform during the GNU because they were corrupt. You'll be surprised the number of people who bent over backwards to give an excuse why MDC guys failed to implement even one reform. I think this is another weakness in our society. We never want to deal with the facts and the reality. And that doesn't help a country move forward. And that is also very unfortunate. Whether we like it or not, we can keep on asking the wrong question. It is not going to help us get out of this mess. I believe asking and expecting that we must blame Zanu PF because they are in power for the country's economic meltdown is asking the wrong question. That question was asked a long time ago, and we did answer it. And we agreed that as long as Zanu PF is in power, we are not going to get any meaningful change. And that is why we needed the democratic reforms. That is why people have risked life and limb and livelihoods to elect MDC and Triple C into power on the understanding they will implement the reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. The right question you should be asking is, why is it that 23 years after independence, after we started electing the opposition, and including 5 of those in the GNU, why is it that we have not got even one token reform? Why is Zanu PF still able to rig the elections? What you need is a competent opposition that will implement the reforms to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. What you need is a competent opposition that will not participate in a flawed election to give Zanu PF legitimacy. Ask the right question and you get the right answer, and we'll make progress. That question that was being asked by Pastor Chiwenga is the wrong question. It's the foolish question. It's the idiotic question. One would expect from one with a little learning, as Alexander Pope would put it. With that, thank you very much for listening, and good night.